Hello and welcome to Broken Entertainment, and today is our writing Sunday, so I'm going to talk about something that means a lot to me with writing, and in this case we're going to talk about how, to me, Brandon Sanderson saved modern fantasy. I'm not going to say he saved modern fantasy for everyone, but for me, he saved modern fantasy, and the reason for that is as I set aside my sci-fi projects to edit, I wanted to be writing something else, and I said, I want to write fantasy. I love fantasy. I love fantasy playing D&D. I love fantasy and Warhammer Fantasy. I love Lord of the Rings. And so I started picking up books to read that were modern fantasy because I said, I've got to update myself. At least that's what everybody kept telling me on Twitter. Oh, you got to read new things. If you want to be an author, you got to read new things in the genre. And there's some truth to that. But as I started reading, I picked up one book after the other, and I'm like, I don't like any of this. I was like, where's the fun? Where's the mystery? Where's the enchantment? Where's the magic? And I'm like, maybe I just don't like maybe modern fantasy just isn't my thing. I love Lord of the Rings. That's not exactly modern. The Pern series before it turned into science fiction. I like the science fiction part of it too, but The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, Tolkien, pretty heavily, obviously. Warhammer Fantasy, like I said. But all that's old. Warhammer Fantasy's going on, 40 years old? Lord of the Rings is over 60. And the Game of Thrones came out on TV, and I immediately didn't like that. Because it's all awful people being awful to awful people. And to me, that kind of cynicism, we get enough of that crap in real life. I didn't want it in my fantasy. Not to say that there can't be dark elements to a fantasy, but that kind of dark fantasy of just everybody's awful, everything's awful. Awful, awful, awful. I just... And yeah, this is coming from a 40K fan, right? But in 40K, I see hope. There are good people in 40K. There's not a lot of good people, and they might do things that, if we were saying they were good, if we compared to them people now, we'd be like, well, that's not really a good person. But there are people that are legitimately trying to save others, to save the universe. Whereas Game of Thrones is more people trying to save themselves. And so I was getting to the point where I'm like, I don't know if I can read this. I'd look through the books at the library, the bookstore, and I'm just like, there's just nothing giving my eye. I read, I tried to read The Shadow of What Was Lost because it was a newer author. And I quit less than halfway through because, one, I couldn't tell you who any of the characters were. None of them were really memorable. And two, I figured out where the story was going. And I'm like, oh, yeah. Malice, same way, really. It just never quite grabbed me. I've tried to read through it several times, and the characters are just kind of along for everybody else's ride, I guess, is what it seems like for large chunks of it. And maybe it changes later on, but I've got to be interested enough to get to the later on. So I was at the point where I'm like, maybe I'm just going to have to write it without reading modern fantasy. And I'm like, that may not be a great idea because that'll root it more in Tolkien and older style fantasy. And then finally, I saw this guy named Brandon Sanderson on YouTube, and I saw him through Shadiversity's Shadiversity's YouTube channel, where he had an interview with him. And the thing that stuck out to me was two things. One, how much Shadiversity respected this guy as an author. And two, when he interviewed him and he asked him the question, if you were starting today, how would you start? And he said, self-publishing. A lot of authors don't have the nerve to say that. And I was like, wow. And he was immediately likable in the interview, so I said, I'm going to look up some more about him. I found his channel on YouTube. And he does these live signing sessions where he does live streams. He just answers people's questions. He's very down to earth, very honest, very outgoing. And I'm like, wow, okay. And I found his lectures. He teaches courses on being a novelist. And I'm like, oh yeah, but you're going to have to pay, blah, 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 blah. No, they're free. You can go on YouTube and find the videos for free from him, intentionally, not pirated. And I listened to what he said, and I'm like, wow, this guy is really saying stuff that's way past the crap on Twitter and the stuff people say a lot on YouTube of like, I don't like these tropes, but I like these tropes. I don't like this, but I like that. He was just talking about the process of writing a fantasy or science fiction novel, and he's like making points that are clear, that aren't repeated by everybody else in the room, that make you stop and think like, oh, okay. So I said, I gotta I gotta read one of his books. And I don't really have the time to physically read right now, so picked up Audible again and grabbed Way of Kings. And it's on Audible, it's something like 48 hours long. And I was like, holy crap. But this book is fantastic. It grabs you immediately. Not only can I tell you the characters, I care about them. And in a lot of the ways, it reminded me of what I like about Lord of the Rings, Dungeons and Dragons, and Warhammer Fantasy. They're characters that I really enjoy, who have deep flaws, who are in a world that is not ours. And it's not ours with just a little twist to it. It's a completely different place in which the world building is interwoven into the fabric of the book. It's not presented as exposition. It's just there. It's just they talk about things like they live them. They'll refer to the animals of the world that aren't like our own. And instead of explaining them, they just talk about them. They'll be like, oh yeah, you need to go get that chol over there. And it's like, now that's world building. Because these characters wouldn't explain things. Because this is their life. They're surrounded by it. It would be like you explaining a horse. You just say, go get the horse. And these characters were so great that I'm like, I gotta listen to this whole book. And I'm listening to it the second time, and it's 48 hours long. And it's the optimism and the hope and the inspirational characters that really, really struck me in the world building. And I'm like, that's what I want. That's the problem. Most modern fantasy that I have picked up is either generic or it has a pessimistic worldview. I'm like, there's enough pessimism in real life. I don't need more of it. And like I said, I'm a 40K fan, but you know what I like about 40K is the defiance. By all rights, humanity in 40K should be extinct, but it isn't. Because they won't give in. And there are some awful, awful people in Warhammer 40K. But there's also people like the Space Wolves who are willing to go to war with the entire Inquisition because the Inquisition wanted to kill the survivors of a planet because they saw bad things. And to me, it's like, there is that spark of hope, that spark of optimism, even in a world of total darkness. That's why I like Star Trek. That's why I like Star Wars. That's why I don't like Game of Thrones. And this book has it in spades. You can see things going south, or things are already bad, depending on whose perspective you're reading. But there's optimism. And he's just great by example. You know, I get a lot of people on YouTube, they sit there and they'll talk about, don't do these 10 things, do these 10 things. We need more of this and less of this. We need more Eastern-based fantasy and less Western-based fantasy. We need more diversity and less white males. And it all kind of goes together and it blurs. And this guy just wrote a diverse book without talking about it. And that's a big part of it too. I'm not saying what those other people say is bad. But just talking about it, and talking about it like it's a huge thing, rather than just writing a damn good story and making it a natural part of the world, to me that's a problem. Because the diversity that sits well with me, Star Trek, Star Wars, Way of Kings. I'll show you another example in a minute from science fiction. That diversity is simply there. It's natural. It's a part of the world without lecturing you about it. Because if you want people to see that and not question it, you don't want to lecture them. You want to make it just part of the world. Some of Brandon Sanderson's main characters in The Way of Kings are women. And they do great things. But they don't do great things like men. They're women. The men and the women do different things in different ways. And they have different approaches. Almost like real people, right? Whereas there's this drive, it seems like, especially on Twitter, of, oh no, you gotta make, your fantasy has to have a strong female character. And by strong, we mean she needs to kick everybody's ass with a sword. But that's not the only approach to problems. And it's not the only approach to life. And it's not the only approach to fantasy. And having, not to say you can't have great female warriors, I do. And the example I'm going to show you from science fiction has one. Several. But that it's that approach of just natural diversity occurring naturally in a story that doesn't lecture you, that's more interested in telling a great story. And through telling a great story, exposing its readers to those things that everybody wants. And to me, I'm gonna have to finish this whole series because this book was really damn good, and it showed me what I wanted in fantasy. And therefore it showed me what I wanted in my own writing. Rather than lecturing me and telling me what I have to do, it just did it. So this other example from science fiction is why when people tell me we need more diversity in writing, I kind of scratch my head. Because to me it's always been there. And it makes me wonder, well, what are people reading? So this is a modified version of the book cover from the Battletech novel I Am Jade Falcon. This character, as a teenager and now, was one of my favorite characters of all time in science fiction. It's a woman. She's fantastic as a character. She has major flaws. She's a great mech warrior. She's defiant. Quite often she's furious. A phenomenal character. Part of a diverse background, part of a diverse science fiction setting that has been written since the 80s. So it makes me question when people say, we need more of this. Now, we do. More Eastern fantasy would be great. We don't have a lot of that. I'm not saying those desires are wrong. But I am curious about the diversity thing because I see it everywhere in the books that I read. And I'm like, is it something that isn't there? Or is it something that is there, but that because so much of the writing community is on Twitter, and Twitter is so driven by identity politics, is it something that has just become accepted by the community? Because to me, this diversity has always been here. There are female characters who are awesome and important in Lord of the Rings. Look how long ago Lord of the Rings was written. And of course, diversity isn't just female, skin color, etc., etc. But to me, this is important, but it's important that it be natural and important that it be done well. Because just doing it by force just makes people turn away. And Brandon Sanderson to me exemplifies that. And my question to you, especially if you're in the writing community, is what books are you reading? Because I genuinely want to know what books are being read in fantasy. Because I'm still getting back into modern fantasy. What books are being read in fantasy now that don't have these qualities, that don't have strong female characters, that don't have diverse skin tones? Because everything I have read since I started reading, like seriously reading back in junior high, has had this. So I'm curious. I want to know because I don't know the answer. I don't know, is this a problem in fantasy or is it something that we have been convinced is a problem in fantasy? As far as my own writing, it's diverse because the world is. Not just the world it's taking place in, but the world I live in. There are different races, different species, different genders. One of the major characters, multiple of the major characters are women. There are characters from different racial backgrounds, different species backgrounds. And it's at no point lectured, it's just who they are. And there's some clashes between that because one society is strongly patriarchal, the other society is strongly matriarchal. And other societies have their own issues. but that's meant to be opposing forces kind of thing. And when it comes down to it, not all these characters, but some of them start to work together anyway. But yeah, if you are part of the writing community on YouTube or on Twitter, and you're one of those people who's saying fantasy needs more diversity, please give me examples of books that haven't been doing it, because I'm genuinely curious. Because my exposure to modern fantasy so far is limited to this one great author. So if there are people out there writing now, or who had been writing, let's say modern fantasy, stemming largely from authors raised in the 70s and 80s, I guess, rather than the next wave of fantasy done by authors who are pushing to become authors now. But yeah, if you have those examples, I'd really like to see them. Out of pure, honest, open curiosity. I'm not rejecting the call at all. I just want to see where it's not happening. Because, like I said, this is from I Am Jade Falcon. It was written in the 90s. And it's science fiction, granted. But Lord of the Rings had strong female characters in it. So did Pern, written in the 60s by a woman. So I am really curious. I want to see them. Because if it is a problem, I think it is something we should talk about. Not in the way necessarily that has been talked about in the media of forcing it down people's throats, but of including it naturally into our writing. It's just part of the world. Because when you do that, when you don't piss people off by talking down to them, when it's just part of the book, they accept it rather than turning away from it. So I'm really interested. If you liked the video, hit the like button. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you aren't. Hit the bell for notifications, and I will see you next time.